Since 1967, the Franklin D. Murphy Sculpture Garden has been a fixture on UCLA's North Campus. Spanning 4.5 acres, the garden is situated between 5 buildings and lies in the shadow of Bunche Hall. The garden was the result of the collaboration between UCLA Chancellor Franklin D. Murphy and landscape architect Ralph Cornell. Their design demonstrates certain ideas about art, beauty, and what a garden is supposed to look like. To support this concept of a garden, irrigation infrastructure plays an essential and mostly hidden role. The sprinkler heads and pipes are at once ubiquitous and blend in with the landscape. The original plans called for a central zone of graded turf grass framed by trees and shrubs, which creates a park-like atmosphere where people can walk and sit. It also requires plenty of water in a dry Mediterranean climate. The garden replaced an old dirt parking lot, so much of the irrigation infrastructure was installed while the garden was being constructed, beginning in 1965. At the same time, the architects had to account for the location of existing water lines, as well as the construction of new electrical lines that would help light pathways at night. The original infrastructure consisted largely of underground galvanized steel pipes with sprinkler heads spaced at regular intervals to allow water to be evenly distributed. But galvanized steel is subject to corrosion over time, so in the 1990s, the pipes were replaced with polyvinyl chloride, or, as most people call it, PVC. Finally, in 2009, drip irrigation lines were added to areas of the garden with trees and undergrowth. So why does it matter? Why have a sculpture garden anyway? To answer that question, we have to step back in time. UCLA was established in 1919 as the southern branch of the University of California and moved to its current location in Westwood in 1929. But even by 1960, when Franklin Murphy arrived as chancellor, in many ways, UCLA was still thought of as a satellite of the more prestigious UC Berkeley. UCLA was also in a period of major expansion as the first generation of baby boomers began to arrive at campus. These factors contributed to Murphy's interest in growing the university's fine arts program on the less developed North Campus. The sculpture garden became part of that vision. Murphy drew his inspiration from European gardens and public squares, like the Piazza di Spagna in Rome. He was also influenced by the establishment of new sculpture gardens in the United States, such as the garden at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He saw this as an opportunity to bring art and culture to a campus and city that were considered lacking in both. So when Murphy approached Ralph Cornell with his idea, he had very definite concepts of what a campus ought to look like and what made something fine art. This meant turf grass, fountains, and trees, something entirely different from the native landscape. These notions of art and culture are embedded in Cornell's ultimate design and the underlying infrastructure. Beyond that, the notion of a campus as a place for peaceful study is an interesting contrast to what was actually happening in the wider context of the 1960s. The garden was conceived and built at the height of the civil rights movement and as anti-Vietnam War protests began to intensify. Although campus protests at UCLA never reached UC Berkeley's notoriety, they increased in number and intensity over the course of Murphy's tenure. There were suggestions that the new garden should be fenced off to prevent vandalism, but Murphy refused, arguing that a fence would make the garden seem like part of the establishment, and therefore more vulnerable to being defaced. In this light, the design of the garden itself shows a desire to become a space outside of protest, that somehow could transcend the politics of the time. But attempts to be non-political are political acts in themselves, and Murphy himself could not transcend the politics of the time. By 1968, just 1 year after the dedication of the garden, Murphy resigned as chancellor. In the years after his departure, the protests continued, but the garden bearing his name became accepted as a fixture on campus. And students, staff, faculty, and visitors still largely use the space in the way Murphy and Cornell intended. They sit on the grass, read, sleep, have lunch, and interact with the artwork. The trees have matured, and the sculptures have come and gone. Apart from the major renovation in the 1990s, the garden seems almost untouched by time. But the story doesn't quite end there. One characteristic of infrastructure is that it is modular, made up of standardized pieces that can come together to form a complex whole. We see this characteristic in the drip irrigation lines that were installed in 2009. Drip irrigation is a method that delivers water directly to the roots of the plant, as opposed to distributing it widely like a sprinkler. In the past few decades, drip irrigation has gained popularity for using less water more efficiently than traditional sprinklers. Furthermore, years of drought in California have increased pressure on institutions to demonstrate commitment to sustainability and the environment. In addition to installing drip irrigation on different parts of campus, UCLA has worked to reduce water usage in landscaping through use of artificial turf and drought-tolerant plantings. But don't expect artificial turf to replace the grass in the sculpture garden anytime soon. And it's unlikely we'll see the dense green undergrowth taken out in favor of cactus. Despite a reduced watering schedule, the shadiness of the garden keeps it relatively cool throughout the day. Ralph Cornell's original challenge of dealing with the deep shadow of Bunch Hall turned out to be an asset. Moreover, seriously altering the irrigation infrastructure and re-landscaping would fundamentally change the ways people interact with the space. After all, you can't lie down and nap in a cactus garden. Thanks to the mostly hidden infrastructure, we can expect the garden to stay green and lush all year round for the foreseeable future. So when you visit, don't just look up and appreciate the sculptures, appreciate what lies underneath.